here. That is all this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Good evening, Chris. Thanks, my friend.
You bet.
And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. It was 1 year ago today that the Trump White House personnel carousel first fell off its axis and started randomly flinging people off into the night. A year ago today, White House National Security Advisor Mike Flynn became the shortest-lived ever National Security Advisor when, after 24 days on the job, he resigned. You know, it's interesting. Ever since then, that story has been told as Mike Flynn being fired as National Security Advisor after 24 days on the job. He didn't actually get fired, though. He was allowed to resign. And that detail is easier to remember when you look back on how the president talked about Flynn at the time.
Michael Flynn, General Flynn, is a wonderful man. I think he's been treated very, very unfairly by the media. Call it the fake media in many cases. And I think it's really a sad thing that he was treated so badly. I think it's very, very unfair what's happened to General Flynn, the way he was treated. Very, very unfair.
Clearly, this was not a president who had just fired Mike Flynn. Flynn was allowed to resign. The president said so himself. Awkwardly, standing next to Bibi Netanyahu today, Israeli police announced that he could be indicted on multiple charges. Anyway, just a numerological accident. But the fact that Flynn was allowed to resign, that he wasn't fired, the president made that clear himself. And it was also made clear at one particularly excruciating White House press briefing right after Flynn's departure.
Good afternoon. Happy Valentine's Day. I can sense the love in the room. When the president heard the information as presented by White House counsel, he instinctively thought that General Flynn did not do anything wrong.
Back in January, the president said that nobody in his campaign had been in touch with the Russians. Now, today, can you still say definitively that nobody on the Trump campaign, not even General Flynn, had any contact with the Russians before the election?
My understanding is that what General Flynn has now expressed is that during the transition period, well, we were very clear that during the transition period, he did speak with the ambassador.
I'm talking about during the campaign.
I don't have any. There's nothing that would conclude me that anything different has changed with respect to that time period.
I don't have any. There is nothing that would conclude me. Mike Flynn resigned a year ago today. That was the press briefing that was held a year ago tomorrow when they first had to answer questions about Flynn. So this is day 24 and then day 25 into the new administration. They're brand new. Sean Spicer, as we now know, he had a difficult time with the job of being White House spokesman. This, I think, particularly difficult briefing for him, but he did his best.
Is the administration undertaking any sort of effort, either cabinet-wide or like inside the shop, to make sure that everyone comes forward who had any communications with the Russians about sanctions or otherwise?
There is no other information. I mean, that as far as we are aware, that is an isolated incident that occurred.
That was not an isolated incident that occurred. Will you make any sort of effort to make sure anybody comes forward who had any communications with the Russians about sanctions or otherwise? As far as we was aware, that was an isolated incident. Not an isolated incident. A year ago today, February 13th, was when Mike Flynn resigned because of his undisclosed contacts with the Russian government that he had lied about. A year ago tomorrow is when the White House was trying to explain away his resignation, really more in sadness than in anger. The president was still praising Mike Flynn to the rooftops. The official line on Flynn's undisclosed contact with the Russian government, which he lied about, was that there wasn't really anything wrong with those contacts per se. And anyway, they were an isolated incident. There weren't going to be any other surprises about Trump folks having any other contacts with the Russians. That was a year ago. Within 2 weeks, we'd learned that Attorney General Jeff Sessions had also failed to disclose and then lied about his own contacts with the Russian government. Just a few weeks later, it was presidential son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner who was having to explain his own undisclosed contacts with the Russian government, which he had lied about, not to mention the meeting he took during the transition with the head of a state-run sanctioned Russian bank.
As far as we are aware, that is an isolated incident that occurred.
There were a lot of isolated incidents then, it turned out. But they started with Mike Flynn leaving the White House a year ago today. It has since been a remarkable series of revelations about Trump campaign contacts with the Russian government. It's also been an incredibly tumultuous time in terms of Trump administration people flunking out, people resigning or getting fired or otherwise having to leave high-ranking government service. This is our ongoing list that we are struggling mightily to keep. Can we make that any bigger? I don't even think it's legible. Can we? Yeah! Oh, boom! Thank you. That's why you guys get paid the big bucks. Well done. Font got bigger. Woo! We have been struggling mightily to find the right font, to try to keep this thing updated in terms of senior administration officials who have quit, been fired, or otherwise left. Just in the past 5 days, we have had to squeeze in a third White House deputy chief of staff, a White House speechwriter, a White House staff secretary, the deputy head of the Federal Rail Administration, and the Associate Attorney General, the number 3 person at the Justice Department, all of whom have announced their own departures just within the last 4 or 5 days. But of everybody, Mike Flynn was first. Look at everybody who has come since then. And now today, this totally unprecedented rate of turnover in the White House and in the senior ranks of this administration, it continues to be in focus because all of Washington right now is on the edge of their seat with expectation that President Trump is about to lose yet another chief of staff. John Kelly's taking the blame for the White House handling of Rob Porter, the staff secretary who was pushed out last week after serving more than a year in that high-ranking job without a permanent security clearance because of serious domestic violence allegations against him, allegations that were communicated to the FBI by Porter's ex-wives, and then those concerns were repeatedly conveyed to the White House. As John Kelly has bungled even the basic White House effort to get its story straight about what they knew about Porter and when they knew it and how decisions about his employment and his security clearance and his resignation were handled, the reason it feels like John Kelly might have to go in this scandal is because of the repeated and now increasing reports that White House staff, the people who report to him in the White House, are turning against him with vehemence. In the LA Times yesterday, that dynamic looked like this. Quote, over and over again in the past several days, various White House aides have buttonholed reporters to tell them that they think Kelly either lied to them or tried to get them to lie about what he knew when. In the New York Times, the uprising against Kelly among his own subordinates now looks like this. Quote, Chief of Staff John Kelly's longtime deputy, Kirstjen Nielsen, was not a fan of Rob Porter's. Nielsen has since left the White House to become Secretary of Homeland Security. Nielsen, while in the White House, frequently blocked and tackled for Chief of Staff John Kelly, making herself the main line of approach to him. Without her, officials often approach Mr. Kelly freely now, and he sometimes does not remember what he said to different people. Meow. And now this is what it looks like in the Washington Post in a story just posted tonight. Quote, Kelly, John Kelly, White House Chief of Staff, is a big fat liar, says one White House official who demanded anonymity to share a candid opinion. To put it in terms the general would understand, his handling of the Porter scandal amounts to a dereliction of duty. So White House officials who are willing to speak about John Kelly that way, to the LA Times, to the New York Times, to the Washington Post. Everybody who works in the White House as a White House staffer reports to John Kelly. Those White House staffers are now rushing to reporters all over Washington to tell them how terrible and incompetent they think John Kelly is, that they think John Kelly is, quote, a big fat liar, and further that he has demanded that his subordinates in the White House lie for him on this matter. Once it gets to that point within a staff, that is not likely to be sustainable. A White House that has already lost one chief of staff and 3 deputy chiefs of staff and a national security advisor and all these other people, there is now widespread expectation that President Trump is going to need a 3rd White House chief of staff very soon. And honestly, while we're on the subject, the other very senior White House official who is plainly on the hook for the handling of the Rob Porter matter is the White House counsel, Don McGahn. We'll be talking a little later on this hour about why it is that there's not the same immediate expectation that Don McGahn might also have to resign over this scandal, as well as John Kelly. The answer there might be as simple as the fact that Don McGahn has been in worse than this. Don McGahn is so centrally involved in so many of the biggest Trump administration scandals, from Mike Flynn's resignation a year ago on